In 327 BC, after a decade of relentless conquest that stretched from Greece to the heart of Persia, Alexander the Great stood at the precipice of a new world. His gaze was fixed eastward, towards the fabled lands of India, a realm of immense wealth, strange customs, and formidable armies. The known world lay at his feet, but for a man driven by an insatiable ambition, the world was never big enough. The time had come to cross the Hindu Kush mountains, to march into the unknown, into the valleys of the Indus. The journey was brutal. His army, a hardened core of Macedonian veterans and allied troops, battled not just the treacherous mountain passes but also fierce local tribes who resisted their advance. Every step was paid for in blood. After a grueling winter campaign, they finally descended into the plains of what is now Pakistan. Here, Alexander found a land divided. Dozens of kingdoms and principalities vied for power. Some, like King Ambi of Taxila, saw an opportunity. Faced with the might of Alexander's army, Ambi chose diplomacy over war. He welcomed the Macedonians, offering gifts, supplies, and an alliance, hoping to use Alexander's power against his own rival, King Porus. Porus, ruler of the Paurava kingdom between the Jhelum and Chenab rivers, was a man of a different caliber. He was a towering figure, renowned for his courage and pride. When Alexander's envoys demanded his submission, Porus sent back a defiant reply. He would meet Alexander, but on the battlefield, for Alexander, this was a challenge he could not refuse. The stage was set for one of the most legendary confrontations in ancient history. The Battle of the Hydaspes River, known today as the Jhelum. As Alexander's army reached the banks of the Hydaspes in the monsoon season of 326 BC, they faced a daunting sight. The river was swollen and raging, a torrent of brown water nearly a mile wide. On the opposite bank, King Porus had assembled his army. At its heart was a weapon the Macedonians had never faced in such numbers. 200 war elephants, armored and arranged like living fortresses along the riverbank. Behind them stood 30,000 infantry, thousands of cavalry, and hundreds of war chariots. Porus's plan was simple: use the river as a natural barrier and crush any attempt by Alexander to cross. For weeks, the two armies stared each other down across the turbulent water. Alexander knew a direct assault would be suicidal. His horses, terrified by the sight and smell of the elephants, would be useless, and his infantry would be slaughtered while trying to land. He needed a plan, a stroke of genius that would unravel Porus's seemingly perfect defense. And so, the master of deception went to work. Alexander began a campaign of feints and misinformation. Night after night, he would march his cavalry loudly along his side of the river, making a great show of preparing to cross at various points. At first, Porus would rush his forces to meet the feigned attacks, but as the nights wore on and no attack came, Porus's troops grew weary and complacent. They started to ignore the noise, believing it was just Alexander's bluff. This was exactly what Alexander wanted. He was training his enemy to ignore the real threat when it came. While his main army made a show of activity, Alexander secretly identified a suitable crossing point about 17 miles upstream. It was a spot concealed by a wooded island and a sharp bend in the river, hidden from the view of Porus's main camp. On the night of the attack, under the cover of a ferocious thunderstorm that masked the sound of his movements, Alexander led his elite force to the hidden crossing. It was a perilous gamble. The storm made the river even more treacherous, but it also provided the perfect cover. As dawn broke, a portion of Alexander's force was across the river, but they weren't on the mainland yet. They had landed on what they thought was a peninsula, but was actually a large island, separated from the far bank by another deep channel. His men, soaked and exhausted, had to wade chest-deep through the second channel to finally reach the mainland. It was at this moment that Porus's scouts spotted them. The element of surprise was partial, but the first part of Alexander's audacious plan had succeeded. He was on Porus's side of the river. Porus was initially confused. Was this a diversion or the main attack? He sent a small force under his son to intercept the landing party, but they were no match for Alexander's experienced cavalry and were quickly routed. Porus's son was killed in the skirmish. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Porus made a fateful decision. Leaving a small detachment to watch the rest of the Macedonian army at the main camp, he turned his main force to confront Alexander. The two armies finally met on a muddy plain. Alexander positioned his infantry phalanx in the center, but his true weapon was his cavalry, which he placed on his flanks. Porus, in contrast, placed his faith in his elephants. He arranged them in a single line at the front, with his infantry filling the gaps between them, hoping the massive beasts would break the Macedonian faith. His own cavalry was stationed on his wings to protect his flanks. The battle began. Alexander didn't launch a frontal assault against the terrifying wall of elephants. Instead, he used his superior cavalry to attack Porus's left flank. He sent his horse archers to harass and disorganize the Indian cavalry, then led a devastating charge with his elite companion cavalry. Porus's left-wing cavalry was overwhelmed and forced to retreat, seeking shelter behind their own line of elephants. This created chaos. As the Indian cavalry crowded inward, Alexander's plan unfolded. He had ordered his infantry to advance, not in a direct charge, but with a specific tactic in mind. The pikemen of the phalanx targeted the elephants, mahouts, the drivers, with their long sarissas, and aimed for the animals' eyes and trunks. The elephants, wounded, panicked, and without their drivers, became an uncontrollable force of destruction. They thrashed about, trampling soldiers on both sides, but their rage was mostly directed at their own infantry who were packed closely around them. The disciplined Macedonian phalanx opened and closed its ranks, creating channels for the rampaging elephants to pass through and then attacking them from the sides and rear. The Indian infantry line, which had relied on the elephants for protection, completely disintegrated. They were trapped between the berserk elephants and the relentless advance of the Macedonian pikes. At the same time, Craterus, the commander Alexander had left at the main camp, saw his opportunity. With Porus's army in disarray, he began crossing the river with the rest of the Macedonian forces, entering the battle to complete the encirclement. Porus fought with legendary bravery. Despite being wounded, the king, mounted on his lead elephant, continued to rally his men, throwing javelins at the enemy until he was faint from blood loss. He was one of the last to leave the field. Surrounded and with his army destroyed, Porus finally surrendered. Alexander, who admired courage above all else, rode out to meet his defeated foe. Through an interpreter, he asked Porus how he wished to be treated. Porus's reply is echoed through history. "Treat me, O Alexander, as a king." Impressed by his dignity and valor, Alexander did more than that. He not only returned Porus's kingdom to him, but also granted him additional territories. The two former enemies became allies. The Battle of the Hydaspes was Alexander's final great battle. It was a tactical masterpiece, a testament to his military genius against a formidable and unfamiliar foe. But it came at a high cost. The ferocity of the battle and the terrifying power of the war elephants left a deep impression on his men. When they heard tales of even larger empires and bigger armies with thousands more elephants further east, their morale finally broke. At the Hydaspes River, his weary and homesick army mutinied. For the first time, they refused to go further. Alexander, heartbroken, was forced to turn back. His dream of conquering the entire world had reached its limit, not by a foreign king, but by the will of his own men on the far edge of India. And so, the great conqueror began his long journey home, a journey he would not survive. But the story of his Indian campaign, of his clash with King Porus and the mighty war elephants, would become the stuff of legend, a dramatic final chapter in the epic saga of Alexander the Great. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into the ancient world, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more stories from history.